The afternoon sun over Washington, D.C. had lost its winter bite, leaving a crisp, cool evening that felt electric with the promise of history. The East Room of the White House was a constellation of American power and prestige. Crystal chandeliers rained light down upon a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns, as the cream of the political and cultural elite mingled for the first official state dinner of the new administration. It was a carefully calibrated evening of soft power, a chance for the new president to project an image of stability and grace on the world stage. Melania Trump, the new First Lady, stood near the grand fireplace, a vision of icy perfection in a custom couture gown of pure white. It was a deliberate choice, a blank canvas that spoke of a new beginning. She held a delicate porcelain cup of chamomile tea, her preferred non-alcoholic beverage, her gaze sweeping across the room with the practiced detachment of a former model. She acknowledged compliments with a slight enigmatic smile, her eyes never quite warming. Beside her, a social aide kept up a quiet stream of identification. That's the Argentine ambassador with his wife, the Senate Majority Leader is by the piano, and the president is just entering with the honoree. Donald Trump, in his signature long red tie and dark suit, was in his element, holding court near the grand piano. His laugh was a loud, booming affair that cut through the refined murmur of the crowd. He was leaning in, telling a story to a cluster of guests, his hands moving animately. He was performing, as he always did, for an audience of one, himself. Across the room, a different kind of power gathered. Former President Barack Obama, distinguished in a classic black tuxedo, stood with a small group that included a revered Supreme Court justice and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. His posture was relaxed, his head tilted in that familiar gesture of attentive listening. He would occasionally interject with a quiet comment that would elicit thoughtful nods or soft laughter from his companions. He was the picture of elder statesman gravitas, the steady hand of the past observing the chaotic present. Michelle Obama, radiant in a deep emerald velvet gown that seemed to hold the light, was a few feet away, speaking with the honoree, a renowned climate scientist. Her laugh was genuine and warm, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch the scientist's arm to emphasize a point. She was a force of nature, her presence filling the space not with volume, but with an undeniable charisma that drew people in. She was the heart of the room, the emotional center around which the political gravity of the Obamas orbited. The contrast between the two camps, the boisterous, transactional energy of the new administration and the cool, intellectual grace of the old, was a living, breathing narrative that every guest was acutely aware of. The dinner itself was a parade of exquisite courses and carefully managed seating arrangements. Melania was seated at the head table, flanked by a European prince and the Secretary of State, engaging in the requisite small talk with professional grace. Her husband, at the center of the table, was more focused on the meal and the service, occasionally signaling to a waiter with a pointed look. As the final course was cleared and the delicate clinking of forks on dessert plates subsided, the White House social secretary, a polished woman named Olivia Perez, approached the head table. She leaned between Melania and the prince, her voice a discreet whisper meant only for the First Lady's ears. "Mrs. Trump, I apologize for the interruption," Olivia murmured, her professional smile fixed in place. "We have a slight timing issue. The musical performance is ready to begin, but the president is engaged in a rather animated conversation with the governor. We need to bridge a gap of about 5 minutes before we can transition to the East Room. We were hoping you might be willing to say a few words, just to welcome everyone and thank our host committee. A very brief toast, perhaps." Melania's eyes flickered towards her husband. He was, indeed, deep in conversation, his back half turned to the room, seemingly oblivious to the schedule. This was typical. The schedule was a suggestion, a mere obstacle to his immediate desire.
She looked back at Olivia, her expression unchanging. "And the program? This is not my role tonight." "I know, and I am so sorry for the last-minute change," Olivia pressed gently, her anxiety barely concealed. "But it would be such a help, just a minute, maybe two, just to hold the room." Melania gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "I will do it." Olivia's relief was palpable. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump. I'll cue the microphone." She slipped away, a ghost in a navy suit. Melania placed her teacup down on the tablecloth with a soft, definitive click. She smoothed an invisible wrinkle on her gown and rose from her chair, a slow, regal ascent. The movement caught the attention of those nearby, and a hush began to ripple outwards from the head table. People turned, expecting perhaps the president to be finally taking the floor. Instead, they saw the First Lady, standing alone, a figure of white marble against the opulent backdrop.
She took a single step forward, closer to the center of the room, her heels making no sound on the thick Persian rug. The murmur of conversation died down completely, replaced by an expectant silence. All eyes were on her. And then, from the other side of the room, another figure began to move. Michelle Obama, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's energy, perhaps simply ready to move on to the next part of the evening, had begun to walk towards the grand arched doorway that led to the East Room. Her path was taking her directly across the open space where Melania now stood, poised to speak. For a split second, the two women were on a collision course. Melania, with the floor silently ceded to her, was about to address the nation's most powerful people. Michelle, completely unaware of the last-minute change, was simply heading for the exit. She was mid-stride, her gaze forward, a polite smile on her lips for anyone she might pass. It was a moment of silent, high-stakes choreography. Protocol would normally dictate that the current First Lady takes precedence, but the former First Lady was in motion, a powerful presence moving through the room. The social aides froze, their eyes wide. The guests held their breath, sensing the sudden sharp tension. Melania saw her. She saw the path Michelle was on, and in that instant, a cold current of resolve, honed over decades in the merciless gaze of the fashion industry and the brutal arena of political life, surged through her. She would not be upstaged. She would not be rendered invisible in her own moment, on her own night. The schedule, her husband's disregard for it, and now this, it was a familiar feeling of being a secondary character in a story written by others. With a grace that was almost imperceptible, but absolutely deliberate, Melania took 2 more steps forward and slightly to her left. It was a subtle but decisive move that placed her directly in Michelle Obama's path, a few feet from the center of the room. She was no longer just standing. She was now an immovable object, blocking the route to the door. Michelle, her focus on the doorway ahead, didn't see the obstacle until she was nearly upon her. She looked up, and her eyes met Melania's. It was a clash of worlds. Michelle's warm, open gaze met Melania's cool, guarded one. The room seemed to inhale. Melania didn't smile. She simply raised her chin a fraction of an inch and spoke, her voice a low, clear alto that carried in the stunned silence. "Michelle." It was not a greeting, it was a statement, a gentle but absolute assertion of presence. She had not just interrupted her movement, she had claimed the space, the moment, the narrative. Michelle stopped dead in her tracks, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her features before they settled into a polite, questioning mask. It was a look that said, "What is this? What are you doing?" For a heartbeat, the two women stood there, the embodiment of 2 eras, 2 Americas, frozen in a silent tableau. Then the room reacted. A low, collective gasp escaped from 100 throats, immediately stifled. It was the sound of shock, of protocols shattered.
A clink of a champagne flute dropped by a startled guest echoed like a bell. A social aide's face went pale, then flushed crimson. The Secret Service agents, ever watchful, tensed almost imperceptibly, their eyes darting between the two principals, assessing a threat they couldn't quite define. Barack Obama, from across the room, straightened up instantly, his historian friend forgotten. His jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath his cheek. He took a half-step forward, a protective instinct, before stopping himself. His eyes were fixed on his wife, a silent question in them. Donald Trump, mid-sentence with the governor, felt the change in the room's atmosphere before he understood it. He looked up, his story dying on his lips. He saw his wife, standing alone, facing down Michelle Obama. He saw the frozen crowd. He didn't understand the nuance, the subtle choreography that had just occurred, but he understood power and territory. He saw his wife holding her ground, and a flicker of something, perhaps pride, or simply recognition of a kindred territorial instinct, crossed his face. He said nothing, just watched. The murmurs started, a low, shocked buzzing. "Did you see that? Blocked her path. Did she just stop her? Oh my God, the look on Michelle's face." The carefully constructed veneer of diplomatic civility had cracked, and beneath it, raw human drama was spilling out. For what felt like an eternity, but was only a second or two, Michelle held Melania's gaze. Her expression was unreadable, a masterclass in composure. Then, with a grace that was both effortless and monumental, she made a choice. She didn't challenge, she didn't retreat. She simply adjusted. Her smile, if possible, became even more gracious, more disarming. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that was neither submissive nor aggressive, but simply knowing. It was the nod of someone who had been in more of these rooms, navigated more of these minefields than the woman standing before her ever had. "Melania," Michelle said, her voice warm and clear, as if this were a planned, pleasant encounter. "What a lovely evening. I was just going to find a bit of air before the music. Please don't let me interrupt." The words were a masterstroke. With effortless elegance, Michelle had completely reframed the moment. She had transformed Melania's aggressive interruption into an innocent crossing of paths. She had given Melania the floor, but on her own terms, with a magnanimity that only highlighted the awkwardness of the moment. She stepped smoothly to the side, not around Melania, but giving her a wide berth, and continued her path towards a set of French doors leading to a small balcony, her stride unhurried,
The air
her head
whooshed
high.
out of the room. The tension broke, replaced by a wave of frantic, whispered conversation. Olivia, the social secretary, looked like she might faint. Melania stood there for a moment longer, the spotlight now solely and uncomfortably hers. She had gotten what she wanted, the floor. But the manner in which she had gotten it, and the way Michelle had so gracefully sidestepped the confrontation, left a bitter taste in the air. She looked utterly alone in the middle of the opulent room, a solitary figure in white, the center of attention, but isolated by the very act that had given her the stage. Clearing her throat, she began to speak. Her voice was steady, but the usual practiced smoothness was gone, replaced by a slight, almost imperceptible tightness. "Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the President and myself, I want to welcome you to the White House for this special evening." She delivered the brief, prepared remarks Olivia had suggested. She thanked the committee, welcomed the honoree. It was perfectly adequate, but the words fell on ears still buzzing with the silent drama they had just witnessed. The magic was gone. The room was no longer listening to a First Lady's toast. They were analyzing a performance, watching a woman who had just committed a major social faux pas try to recover. When she finished, the applause was polite but scattered and uncertain. It lacked the warmth of genuine appreciation.
It was the applause of a relieved audience, glad the awkward moment was over. Across the room, Barack Obama had moved to the French doors, positioning himself near where his wife now stood on the balcony, her back to the room, her shoulders straight. He didn't go out, just stood in the doorway, a silent sentinel. He didn't look at Trump, who was now making his way towards the East Room with a forced joviality, clapping a few guests on the back as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had happened, something significant. The rest of the evening was a footnote. The musical performance in the East Room was exquisite, but few could recall a single note. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long glances towards the Obamas, who stayed for a polite interval before making their exit, their departure a quiet, dignified counterpoint to the earlier drama.